Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this talk, and thank you for being here. I'm really happy that you're all here. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement that we are on the traditional ancestral ceded, otherwise known as occupied territory of the Muslim people. The question of land and land occupation, of course, is very much at the forefront of everyone's mind, reminding us colonization is not the past series of events. The question of land and land ownership also plays a role in your talk. So the question of land and land ownership, colonial history and colonial present will also be a part of the paper. I'm really pleased that José is here to give a public talk. It's been an absolute pleasure to have him in the department. Professor José Sergio Fonseca de Carvalho is Senior Professor of Philosophy of Education in the School of Education at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. His research focuses on links between politics, ethics, and education, drawing from the work of people like Hannah Arendt, Jacques Rancière, and Paul, and you'll hear those influences in this talk. I've never wished more that I read and spoke Portuguese, because then I would be able to read some of his books published in Portuguese, which include titles such as Jacques Rancière in the School, Education, Politics, and Emancipation from 2022, and Education, an Inheritance Without a Will meaning testament, not volition, Dialogues with Hannah Arendt's Thought from 2017. He's affiliated with the Brazilian and French Philosophy of Education Societies and was previously a visiting scholar at the University of Paris 7 and 8. José's been in the department since February of this year, and it's been an extraordinary pleasure to have you, because it's not often that there's a visiting scholar who is so deeply engaged with the department, attending doctoral colloquia, other presentations, department meetings, and working with at least Sam and me, that I know of, and possibly others, on writing and translation. In the talk today, Philosophical Inquiry and Teacher Education, an Exercise in Educational Thought, you will hear the scholarly influences, in particular Rancière and Arendt. You'll also hear a little bit about José's teaching and his teaching approach, which I personally find very moving, and the strong connections between scholarship and teaching. So, José?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for that generous presentation. And good afternoon, everybody. I'd like, first of all, to express my really great, deep gratitude to Claudia, to André, and to Jennifer for their efforts in making this meeting happen, and above all, for making our stay here in Vancouver so fruitful and so pleasant. In fact, I was telling Anne that it has been so fruitful and so pleasant that we were supposed to stay here till July, but we're going to stay till end of December. And I also want to thank all of you, my colleagues, my friends, and family for attending this meeting. I hope it's not too boring. Dominique always says that she feels bored in philosophy classes. So, well, and the text that I'm going to present you, I'm going to read the text because English is not my mother tongue, so I thought it would be too risky to improvise talk in English. It is divided into 3 parts. The first part is a brief reflection on how I conceive the role of philosophy of education in teachers' education programs. And then the second part is a reflection on what I claim to be one of the specificities of philosophy in embracing school experience as an object of thought. And lastly, I narrate Sandra's story as a way to show how I think that a singular school experience might help us to think about important educational issues from not from the macro perspective, but from a very down-to-earth perspective of the agents and their experience. Okay, so I'll read the text and make some small side comments once and then. And I also thank Vicente that I asked him to project the text, so if I mispronounce a word, you may understand exactly what I meant and not what I said. Well, the thoughts that I'm about to share with you this afternoon maybe see as a kind of a response to the question that Claudia Rutenberg posed to her colleagues over a decade ago when she organized a book called What Do Philosophers of Education Do? But instead of prioritizing the philosophical inquiry as academical scholarship, I here propose to emphasize its role in teacher education. And within this specific delimitation, I propose another specific focus in which the transmission of the historical legacy of philosophy, reified in its classical works, Frey's works, Plato, gives way to the actual exercise of philosophical activity in itself in classroom. This does not mean that I undervalue the importance of this historical legacy. Much on the contrary, I believe that a meaningful philosophical inquiry always requires conversations with philosophers that preceded us. In my view, both educational and philosophical practices can be seen as an ongoing conversation between each new generation and a legacy of symbolic achievements passed down from the past, or we could say, in other words, a dialogue that every generation has with a tradition that is in motion. However, for this tradition to remain relevant and alive, it must be examined in the light of present experience and present challenges. So the approach I have adopted to tackle this issue results, at least in a certain way, from my 30 years of teaching experience in the School of Education, and testifies to a strong belief in the role of philosophy in teacher education. And I do not conceive philosophy of education as a mere collection of propositions, answers, and normative horizons to be transmitted to student teachers. Instead, I view it as a quite specific way of questioning our professional choices and responsibilities, searching primarily for meaning and not just for efficiency and effectiveness. Consequently, I claim that although philosophy may not offer immediate solutions to some important practical challenges in education, such as teaching techniques and skills which are necessary, the exercise of narrating and reflecting on actual school experience could significantly impact the way teachers understand the ethical and political significance of their profession and the meaning of their relationship with the new generations. However, most current curriculum guidelines for teacher education, at least in Brazil, tend to ignore the importance of theoretical disciplines, prioritizing the development of what are supposed to be the necessary and effective teaching skills and competencies. The belief underlying this shift that we have seen over the last decades in Brazil, the belief underlying this shift is that the nature of a teacher's daily work and the criteria for assessing its excellence and also the excellence of a teacher's education course are somewhat analogous to that of an industrial production worker, in which techniques developed by experts, usually experts that are not in place at schools, should be transmitted, learned, and applied to guarantee standardized and adequate outputs. However, the nature of each of these professions is fundamentally different and should be treated as such. We may envisage this radical difference by resorting to a simple, trivial example. Like any inanimate material, the steel sheets used by metal workers in an industry to shape car bodies respond only to the physical and to the chemical process performed on them by the workers or by the machine these works operated. They are indifferent. The steel sheets are indifferent to the worker's personality, to his view concerning his profession, etc. The relationship between teachers and students is radically different. First, students do not just react to the process and to the materials they are exposed to. They interact with them and in a very personal way. And this applies to any pedagogical resource, be it a novel, a physics textbook, or a piece of clay in a ceramic class. However, it is not only about teaching techniques and resource. Students also, and I would say above all, respond to who, not to what the teacher is, but to who the teacher is as a professional and as a person. They, the students, respond to the unique character of a teacher's curricular and methodological choices and the ethical and political significance a teacher attaches to their professional and institutional bonds. In other words, students respond to the teacher's personal relationship with the subject they teach. And this we know because how many of us have not become absolutely passionate about literature, about one book, or about history, about a historical event, for the sheer influence of our teachers' own passion on that. They, the students, react to the personal character of the teacher's curricular and methodological choice. Also, how many of us have not distanced ourselves from a subject because of how a teacher approached it? They, the students, react to the ethical and political significance that a teacher attributes to their professional practices. Again, how many of us have not felt welcomed or rejected by a simple gesture, a simple look, or a word from a teacher? How many of us have not awakened to the struggle for social justice inspired by the example of a teacher? In school contexts, interactions between teachers and students are always primarily organized around learning and teaching a subject matter. However, these interactions include more than just imparting information, transmitting knowledge, or developing capacities. They involve a subtle interplay between how one sees and transmits the nature and the meaning of the discipline, their views on education and the younger generation, the social role of our profession, etc. Essentially, every educational act reveals a form of relationships we established with a legacy of symbolic achievements we are supposed to pass on to the younger ones. Often, what we remember most from our educational experience is not the explicit contents we were taught, but rather the way we experience those relationships. Education is thus, in my view, not child-centered nor teacher-centered, and maybe not even world-centered, as Bista claims. Its centers, in my point of view, lies precisely in the in-between space these agents experience as they are placed in a complex web of interactions mediated by institutional practice and educational choices. Therefore, limiting the concept of educational quality to some measurable learning outcomes in standardized tests like PISA, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, PISA, seems at least very reductive. And the same goes for estimating a teacher's excellence or a teacher's education course excellent. It surely encompasses their capacity to impart information, to develop competences, but it goes far beyond that. Being a student, or having been one, we all know that a good teacher is much more than someone capable of conveying knowledge or developing skills. It is rather about those small gestures that may make students curious about worlds they have never inhabited, but may now inhabit by reading a book, studying literature, practicing a sport. It is about sharing the joy of studying a topic that, up to then, had never captured their attention. It is about teaching and learning to acknowledge our debts with the victims of history and act accordingly. It concerns, thus, the way we care about those who came before us, the way we care about those who will come after us, and the way we care about those who share this common present world with us. In short, it is about a singular and personal way of providing opportunities for each one to choose how they want to spend their lives and, maybe even much more importantly, in whose company they want to spend their lives. And this whose company may be the dead or the living. We may choose as a company Arendt, Plato, John Steinbeck, or our classmate beside us. And this company may endure our whole life. This almost artisanal character of the work of a teacher, whose singular vision of their profession and discipline clings to their classes, the same way that the handprints of the potter cling to a clay vessel in this beautiful image of Walter Benjamin, implies that the teacher education should not be limited to the mastery teachers must have on what they teach and how they do it. Conceiving the teacher as an artisan with singular views about the nature of their work implies that they must be encouraged to question the social, ethical, and political significance of their practices and experience and assume responsibility for their choices. The practice of philosophical inquiry may be particularly interesting for teacher education insofar as it may provide a critical and systematic exercise of narrating, interpreting, and questioning the school experience in its most varied facets. In other words, insofar as it becomes a space and a time where we see school experience as a privileged object of thought. I'll go then to the second part, school experience as an object of thought, which is a bit longer than it should have been, but I didn't have time to make it shorter. I know it sounds absurd, but that's it. Only when you have a lot of time you can make things short. So, embracing school experience as an object of thought is not an exclusive attribute of philosophical inquiry, of course. Thinking, in its strong sense that I use here, of radically questioning statements and assumptions, of carefully examining issues and introducing doubts where there was once the silence of certainty, may also be a crucial component of any sociological or anthropological inquiry, for example. In fact, innovative research hypotheses always come from rigorous and creative thinking. However, the fact is that the relationships scientific research establishes with thinking differ very substantially, in my view, from those that characterize philosophy. For philosophy, thinking is not just a tool for fostering knowledge production. It is instead its driving force, its initial impulse and permanent raison d'etre. Hence, the identification of philosophizing with the figure of Socrates as its very incarnation. Socrates, as you know, does not, in a sense, impart any body of knowledge, but communicates rather an intellectual attitude. His legacy is not a set of doctrines, but a perpetual inclination for critically examining beliefs, convictions, and assumptions we have inherited from the past and now take as crystallized truths and judgments. He engages his fellow citizens in public debates about justice, about virtue and piety, not because he possesses the answers to these questions, nor because he expects to extract from them, from his citizens, any comforting truths. He does so simply because he believes the activity of thinking is valuable in itself, intrinsically valuable. Socrates contends that the betterment of the city and its inhabitants relies less on possessing these answers than on everyone's readiness to question themselves and share their perplexity with others. Socrates embodies, thus, the figure of the philosophos, because his appreciation for the activity of thinking indicates a loving and amicable disposition, the word philos, towards something that he seeks and desires because he considers himself deprived of it, wisdom, sophos. And he does not address, and this is important for us, he does not address his words only to the learned and to the supposedly knowledgeable, but to all those who demonstrate a disposition to think, in this strict sense again of questioning the categories through which we name, we understand and describe our experience and convictions. And here lies another specificity of thinking that distinguishes it from the possession and the production of knowledge in scientific inquiries. Expertise in any scientific field requires a thorough understanding of that field's specific subject matter and investigative practices. For instance, only those familiar with sociology or history's cognitive contents and practice can produce knowledge in those areas. Even though sociologists or historians of education may be able to both produce knowledge on educational practice and assumptions and critically examine them, these two intellectuals' activities do not coincide. And in fact, it's not uncommon for a renowned scientist or historian to be unable to critically examine their own practice, their experience, and judgments. And here we have a lot of great examples, from Oppenheimer, for example, political judgment, to talking about philosophers, Heidegger, who accepted, as you know, to be the rector of Heidelberg's University under the Nazi regime. And he used to, before signing all his official correspondence, used to write Heil Hitler. Never apologized, never justified, so cannot even talk about what was his political judgment. Conversely, someone with no formal scientific training or education may exhibit an exceptional capacity for critical judgment in relation to personal, ethical, or political issues, like my mother, who had 3 years of schooling, or your grandfather, who had also 3 years of schooling. Knowledge of ethical theories and political doctrines does not necessarily make a renowned professor in these fields a champion of morality or of political judgment. Expertise in a field of specialization is for a few, but faculties such as thinking, judging, and reflecting are common to all of us. These faculties do not require specialization, but rather a disposition that may become a habit. And here I'm referring a bit to Aristotle when he says that these dispositions become like a second nature to us, like wearing clothes. Of course, it's an acquired habit, but we cannot do without it anymore. Once we have acquired, it's there. These faculties, so I'll read again. And these faculties do not require specialization, but rather a disposition that may become a habit, that of critically interrogating a cultural community's experience, values, principles, and practical or discursive assumptions. Although thinking is the impetus for philosophical activity and its essential prerequisite, it is not a professional specialty restricted to philosophers, and Kant knew it. He always referred to philosophers as professional thinkers with a lot of irony. In fact, recognizing thinking and judging as common human capacity underlies any principle of ethical, political, and legal responsibility that we attribute to everyone for their actions. A crime may result from a thoughtless act, but the absence of reflection on its motives and its consequence cannot be justifiably claimed or accepted as a reason for impunity. Disastrous political choices, such as those that we have made and witnesses in Brazil but worldwide, might result rather from a lack of thinking or a refusal to reflect than from ignorance or insufficient knowledge. It is worth recalling an uncomfortable truth for educators. The Germany that brought Hitler to power had a school system envied by other European countries. The Argentina that has recently elected Milei has one of the best public education systems in Latin America, far superior, for example, to that of South Africa, which once elected Nelson Mandela. However, there is a second relevant difference between the acts of producing knowledge and thinking. Scientific research products are always reified in theories, in books, articles that attempt to describe, to understand, or explain a phenomenon or a state. These products are constantly subject to specialized scrutiny to be validated as true. This validation process is essential to lend legitimacy and credibility to claims made in the scientific community. For instance, claims about a drug's efficacy require specialized critical analysis to lend them the status of truth. The same principle applies to the humanities and education sciences, albeit with different validation criteria. A statistical study on functional illiteracy must be reliable, and a historiographical work must count on documents and draw plausible inferences. Therefore, even if fallible, provisional, and partial, the search for its truthful nature lends legitimacy to knowledge, to scientific knowledge. That is why we constantly subject it to specialized public scrutiny, such as a thesis defense or critical peer review. However, if knowledge always moves in search of intersubjective truth, the same does not occur with thinking. What drives thinking is not the pursuit of truth, but the attribution of meaning or significance to our experience. As in those moments we withdraw to reflect on something that has happened to us, trying to extract some meaning from it. Thinking involves, thus, cultivating a disposition to inquire about the existential and political significance of an event, a practice, or an engagement in world affairs. Regarding school experience, the challenge lies, in my view, in attributing meaning to events, actions, and agents involved in its web of interactions. One should perhaps say a meaning, to emphasize that school experiences are personal, contingent, and singular in nature, and therefore will always admit a plurality of meanings. For example, two twin sisters may have lived exactly the same experience, but attribute to them quite different meanings, sometimes complementary, but sometimes conflicting meanings to the same experience. It's important to note that the search for meaning does not equate to establishing a finality or a function for the school experience, although these two terms may be used interchangeably in everyday language, meaning and finality. In opposition to the notion of meaning, the notion of finality operates from an instrumental point of view. Derived from the human experience of manufacturing objects, the notion of finality refers to something produced as a means whose end lies outside itself. For instance, a table is made and purchased as a means whose end is predetermined and external to its production process. The end of a table could be, for example, to support a computer. But the use of computer, which was its end, becomes a new means for another equally extrinsic end, such as writing an academical article. Thus, an infinite chain of means and ends is created, a chain devoid of any intrinsic significance or meaning. Once the article will also become a means to another end, like improving one's academic CV. And then improvement of the CV is a means to another end, for example, get a grant to be at the UBC, and so forth. On the other hand, meaning refers to the intrinsic value we attribute to a practice or to an object. For instance, friendship is not guided by any external purpose or finality beyond its own cultivation. To view friendship as a means to achieve some further end, such as borrowing money, implies ignoring or degrading the concept of friendship itself. A friend may occasionally lend us some money, but the meaning of friendship cannot be conceived in terms of pre-established instrumental objectives or finalities. In this sense, cultivating friendship has no instrumental finality, although it may have a profound and irreplaceable meaning or significance in our existence. Similarly, we may relate to some objects, not due to any instrumental purpose, but only based on the personal meaning we attribute to them. We may keep, for example, and take care of an old typewriter inherited from our father just because of the emotional significance we attach to it, despite it no longer having any utility or exchange value for us. I myself, for example, cannot type and do have a typewriter that I inherited from my father. Although trivial, simple, this example demonstrates that the concepts of finality and meaning are not inherent qualities of objects or social practice, but rather depend on the relationship that we establish to them. For example, for my father, the typewriter had an utility value, of course. These different ways of relating to an object are not mutually exclusive, but cover a range of degrees and nuances of intersection. For instance, we may approach poetry from an instrumental perspective, studying it solely for its potential to help us in school exams. On the other hand, we may also perceive an intrinsic existential meaning within poetry, whose value may not be understood by any external factor except for the aesthetic experience that it provides us. Therefore, we can switch back and forth between these two ways of relating to the same object. The same applies to schooling as both a personal and a social experience. We may consider it as a means to an end, such as promoting economical growth or social justice, or cultivating citizenship, education, etc. Or we may see it as an experience with an intrinsic value that may have unforeseeable effects on the subjectivation process of those who undergo it. In other words, we can approach it through its supposed political, social, economical, structural finalities, or by highlighting its personal and social meanings. I would like to suggest that a philosophical inquiry that explores the existential and political implications of school experience can challenge some prevailing notions about the roles of school in our societies. I don't mean to state that these notions or the images they create are false or are incorrect or mistaken, but I think that they may often fail to consider a crucial question: what may school experience signify for those directly involved in their complex interactions? To exemplify my claim, I would like to propose a brief exercise in educational thought based on an experience shared with me by one of my students. This exercise aims to understand the various meanings school experiences may have in shaping the subjectivity of those who live it. I suggest that by examining the actual experience of teachers and students, we may shift from the macro, social, and structural perspectives to the micro level of small phenomena. Through this approach, we may, for example, better understand the complex and paradoxical relationship that school has with some of its historical established social and political commitments, like equality and emancipation, that in some contemporary educational discourses have been portrayed as mere or solely ideological ploy aimed at legitimizing oppression and submission. I also claim that the personal and social meaning of this specific time and specific space dedicated to educating young people, the school, can only be grasped by delving into and narrating this unique and sometimes paradoxical experience we often undergo as teachers or students. These experiences, whose effects are indeterminable, become memorable moments in configuring our narrative identities, narratives through which we tell ourselves and others how we came to be who we are. And we are nothing but our own history, a history that we weave in the intertwining of our lives with the lives of people we encounter, with the stories that spring from our interactions with books, with films, sports, events, and artworks that leave their mark on us, with experience in institutions that welcome or reject us, stories that narrates the deeds we brought about and the tragedies that befell us. Sandra's story, the narrative of a school experience. Sandra was my student in a PhD program, and I asked her if I could tell that story beforehand. I sent her the story. Sandra was born in the state of Minas Gerais, in southeastern Brazil, as a black child and the daughter of two black illiterate farmers workers who cultivated a land that did not belong to them, for it was owned and ruled by a white master, a master of lands, a master of cattle, a master of people, a master who was the son of another master for whom Sandra's grandparents used to work, just like her grandparents, who were torn from their homeland, separated from their people, their customs, their religion, because they were trafficked and sold to white masters as enslaved black workers. The past reproduced itself, determining each one's proper place, viewed as their natural destiny. However, Sandra's parents wanted her and her sisters to go to school, a place that had never been proper for black girls, once it was a privilege for white boys on their path to becoming masters of black people. But the father warned his girls. It would only take one complaint from the teacher for them to leave school and return to work in the land, as Sandra had already done from age 6 to 9 when she first went to school, just as her parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents had done before her. Thus, school time became a break from her daily struggle for survival. Instead of toiling in fields, taking care of animals, or cooking food, Sandra could now use a pencil to write words and create letters and poems. She could draw and color. It was a privilege her ancestors never had. This privilege was somewhat akin to the one experienced by affluent young men in Athens during the 4th century BC. They gathered to enjoy some free time, what they called some skole, literally free time, a time separated from the demands of everyday life or the struggle for survival. A time they could dedicate to reading poems, studying, learning, questioning, and debating. Having skole, free time, was then about enjoying a space and a time for intergenerational cultural dialogue. But above all, it was about granting those young men an opportunity to give an unpredicted form to their existence, to open new possible trajectories to their lives. With the diffusion of skole beyond the aristocratic castes came a potential split, a split up to then unthinkable between birth and social status, between origin and wisdom. And otherwise, how could the aristocratic Plato consider the poor son of a midwife and a sculptor, Socrates, here he comes again, the wisest man in Athens? Sandra inherited that transmuted tradition from distant times and space. She could enjoy skole and no longer saw herself merely as a body destined for growing and cooking food from which she could only enjoy the remaining crumbs. She could dream of other worlds unfolded to her through the pages of books she started reading. She could engage in conversation with people who had lived in other faraway spaces and distant times. Could this be the meaning of transforming the privilege of skole into a right for all those who had never been seen and treated as entitled to have these rights? The right to inhabit other worlds offered by books we read, by stories we hear, and the artwork we produce and enjoy. The right to give a new form to one's own existence, escaping from what was taken as one's proper place and proper role in life. However, Sandra had not forgotten her father's warning. Just one single complaint could result in her losing her free time and right to attend school. As her family could not afford the expenses of school supplies, she had to use a notebook and a book that belonged to her teacher, who constantly reminded her of her status as a poor black girl by imposing strict and unjustifiable rules. Sandra could only read up to page 12 that week. She had to write on only 2 sheets of paper without any erasures or stains. And Sandra feared, trembled, but obeyed. The school time and rules controlled by the teacher marked Sandra's unequal place among children who, coming from different social backgrounds, were supposed to have equally become just students with the same rights and same duties. But at the same time, at school, Sandra could cease to be the oldest daughter, the one who had to assume the responsibility for her younger sisters, for she had become again just a student like everyone else. Thus, she experienced a new condition, being a student equal to her sister and classmates. But she also experienced the inequality of being a poor black girl among well-off white students. One day, that school received a small library where a new staff member, a librarian, came to work. Upon entering this space for the first time, Sandra was impressed by what seemed to her an unbelievable abundance and variety of books. And I have to tell you that maybe half of the students in Brazil do not have one single book at home, except at school. Confronted with her amazed gaze, the librarian invited her to handle them, to choose one that pleased her. Shyly, Sandra brought him a small, thin book and asked, "Until what page can I read that book?" Astonished, he assured her that she could read as much as she wished and return it whenever she wanted, and that she could take any other book with her. And for a moment, Sandra had the experience of feeling free and equal in a regulated and unequal world. Living as equals in an unequal world. That's the very principle of emancipation according to Rancière. It is an act through which those assigned a subordinate place in society assert, in deeds and words, their equality with each and everyone else. It's not an abstract or legal equality, but rather an equality experienced in limited space and life experiences. For example, when the mere scene of a black girl reading poetry attests to her equal right to enjoy a symbolic inheritance previously reserved only for the privileged young ladies who lived in the master's house premises. An action capable of abolishing the symbolic division, imposing what is proper for each one according to their class, their origin, gender, or color. An equality that's not precisely about overcoming class structure, for which schools would be a means to an end. Instead, it is a modest, circumstantial, specific sort of equality. However, once someone has tasted that equality, even if only for a time lapse, how can they go back unaffectedly to the unequal social order to which they belong? Sandra grew up in a Catholic family and still practices her Christian faith today. It was driven by her faith that she pursued her degrees in philosophy and theology and chose where and with whom she was to carry on her political commitment as an educator. At school, she never had the opportunity to learn about her ancestors' beliefs, rituals, and ways of worshipping their gods. The historical narratives Sandra was taught never mentioned the Yorubas, the Malays, the Bantus, the Nagus, or the Gegés. She was never taught anything about these people who were stripped of their languages, of their culture, history, and even of their names. It took her decades to learn about the struggles of Luiz Gama, the works of Manuel Quirino, the existence of Ganga Zumba, and the resistance of Zumbi. The history of her people was presented to her through the white dominant eyes of the Pedros, the emperors first and second of Brazil, Isabel, the princess, or even worse, Caxias, the general who commanded the massacre of tens of thousands of inhabitants of the Free Black Republic of Angola Janga, or Palmares, in northern Brazil. But if it weren't for school experience, would Sandra have read the poems of black lawyer Luiz Gama, known Quirino's anthropological and artistic works, and admired the courage of Angola Janga's leader, Zumbi? School culture selects, hierarchizes, binds, but also opens perspectives, challenges beliefs, contradicts crystallized legacies. And a final remark. As teachers and educators of teachers, we are heirs to a double and paradoxical legacy. On the one hand, we inherited the Enlightenment narrative assigning schools to promote societal, moral, and political improvements. Schools should be a fundamental instrument for accomplishing the Enlightenment principles of moral, political, and technological progress, viewed as the vector, the aim, and the end, or in other words, the telos, of mankind's historical development. On the other hand, we are also heirs to the repercussions of the criticism that Enlightenment and its redemptive narrative of the school has suffered. This institution, in which the individual and collective hope of social progress and economical development was placed, came to be seen as a machine serving the maintenance and reproduction of social inequalities. The Enlightenment belief in the school's potential emancipatory effect was gradually replaced by the view that, in fact, the schools were no more than a normalizing and conforming institutional device. And here I'd like to resort not to very sophisticated academic scholarship work like Foucault or Bourdieu. Just think of Pink Floyd's The Wall. Huh? We don't need no education. We don't need no thought control. The idea of a school as an emancipatory device was transformed into a thought control institution. We are therefore heirs to a paradox. Enlightenment narratives have led society to establish public school systems and democratize access to education. The critics of Enlightenment narratives have made us aware of their unintended consequence and unmet expectations. Adopting school experience as an object of philosophical inquiry does not enable us to overcome this paradox. Actually, the paradox is not an incidental obstacle, but rather a fundamental aspect of our school system, of our profession, and the social order in which they are situated. As such, we may never be able to theoretically resolve the paradox. All we can do is acknowledge its existence and respond to it through practical and contextualized local initiatives that aim to preserve the dignity of all agents involved in it. As Paul Ricoeur states, we must therefore inhabit the paradox. However, viewing school as a place and a time of paradoxical experience allow us to make, in my view, a significant shift. We may renounce describing, explaining, and interpreting school as if we were looking down at school from the top of a very high building. We may instead try to observe it as someone situated on the ground level. From this perspective, we do not see a movement of anonymous pedestrians following a path idealized by Enlightenment moralists like the history of mankind in direction to the progress, nor do we observe mere victims of any social mechanism. We see, in fact, common yet singular people who, like Sandra, experience school as a time and a space where they live, scenes of submissions, but also of emancipation. We see people who have gone through remarkable experience of freedom and equality, as well as striking traumas. We see discrimination and prejudice, but also solidarity and empathy. Scenes and experience whose effects are always unforeseeable, but which constitute any and every person as a unique human being, much like what happened to each one of us who is now in this room, and to her, Sandra, who has become a philosophy professor in a teacher education program, carrying all that complex school experience with her. In a brief note about this story, I had known Sandra for at least 5 years when I first heard the initial fragments of this story. It was June 2021, and I was offering undergraduates and graduates a course on Rancière's political thought. We had read some of his writings on emancipation and equality, with our attention driven to the scenes in which he narrates how individuals or social groups asserted in action and in words the equality and the rights that had been denied to them. 19th century workers who wrote poetry and philosophy like Denis, when philosophy and poetry was not proper for workers, and women who affirmed the equality of rights proclaimed by the revolution but denied by social order, like Olympe de Gouges, who was killed. I then asked students to bring personal or literary narratives in which they saw a scene of emancipation, preferably linked to a school experience. Sandra, who had always been very shy, surprised me when she took the floor and narrated her story. Her account was brief, a description of her parents, their decision to enroll her at school, her father's warning, and the librarian's words. She then concluded in a simple yet powerful way. At that moment, I felt free as I had never felt before. On the screen of my computer, it was pandemic times, I could see teary eyes amidst a silence that lasted a brief yet eternal moment. It was as if Rancière's writing had gained a new face, Sandra's face, and a new meaning. At the same time, it was as if his philosophy had led her to reconfigure her own story. Just as the experience of workers and revolutionaries had illuminated Rancière's thought, Rancière's writing, had illuminated Sandra's experience. Wouldn't this be the meaning of philosophical inquiry as a formative practice? Well, thank you. I'm sorry. It was a bit too long, but it was as short as I could. So now we talk about it. Yeah.
I'm imagining
Oh, come on. Yeah, please.
Silas, PhD student here. I have a question about the paradox in which you situate us. And the way I heard you, it was an encouragement to sit in this tension. And is that our option, to just reside there, or is it to push in one or other directions in that paradox? Is this like an irresolvable situation in which we just fatalistically exist in this post-enlightenment capture, or do you
Yeah. See, first, I think that it is a fact that we have inherited this paradox. I mean, as everyone else, when I decided to be a teacher, I did because I did believe, in fact, I did believe that we were going to make the revolution through the schools. Till I read Hannah Arendt, and then I said, gosh, what is this? But I think every one of us, in a certain way, accept this normative, this Enlightenment normative horizon of school being a place for autonomous critical thinking. On the other hand, I think we cannot deny that after school established itself as a social institution, it is an institution. It is what Rancière calls the police, not right, taking care that everything is in that place. So I think it's useless to dispute if it's one or another thing, in this sense that I say, I think we have to inhabit, to be in this paradox, to accept it as a paradox. And then maybe search, if it is a paradox, how can we help to bring up small and very punctual scenes of emancipation, of freedom. Like if we had to realize that this freedom is not a place that you get into. It's just a scene that you live. Arendt says, for example, we are free when we act, when we bring something new in the world. Not after, not before. It's just this act that gives us the taste of emancipation, of freedom. And of course, after we are emancipated, the social order is reassured, even if it's a new order. So I don't think we have a way out of living this paradox. And it may be more fruitful if we, like Paul likes to say about a lot of paradoxes, if we inhabit this paradox, and if we try to give it some practical answer, but these practical answers are always, in my view, very local. You cannot export this answer to another context, to another, it's that librarian that saw Sandra and said, just read as much as you want. There won't be another Sandra asking the same question. So I think these are the moments that we really stand for a position of emancipation, of equality. But of course we do the opposite too. Even when you have good intentions, we do the opposite. That's life. And I think if our school experience has some of these moments, of these scenes of emancipation, it's enough. Maybe we can't do better than that. I don't want to sound pessimistic, and I'm not. It's not useless to be able to bring about these scenes, but I think that's the most we can do. Huh? We won't do the revolution at schools, like I believed one day. Yeah, Sergio.
Thank you very much, Professor Carvalho, for a very insightful presentation. And I think that in this department we've been also in different ways struggling with some of these questions in the light of the policies that we have been witnessing or experiencing over the last couple of decades. So thank you very much. Going back to the notion of paradox, actually, I wanted to hear more about this paradox. And I'll say it in a very succinct way first. Is this paradox a real paradox, or is it an artifact of the way you have positioned certain concepts together? For example, you've been referring all the time, including now in your response, that we've inherited a tradition. Like, I would like to know more about what you mean by inherited. To inherit any heritage is to be heir to it. And to be heir to it, one is aligned within a certain ideological and genealogical thing. Did all people inherit the school as such? So what would you mean by inheritance in that sense that establishes this paradox, and therefore we need now to learn how to inhabit that paradox? And I'm saying this because I must confess my knowledge of Brazilian history is quite limited, but looking at other contexts, colonial context, I may know better a little bit. The way the school was inherited was not always the same everywhere. There are contexts of schooling. Like even Sandra, she attended a Catholic school, I suppose under certain conditions. So if you could elaborate a little bit on what do you mean by inheritance and how that inheritance is positioned or could be positioned in relation to the paradox that you have been referring to.
Yeah. Well, the first part of your question is hard because it is a paradox, because both positions and answers, they make sense, but yet they cannot be taken together. They make sense. School has meant for Sandra, as for me, a possibility of emancipation, of social origin. But I don't mean only, it's not a matter just of climbing the social ladder, but giving your existence another meaning that was not previously established to you. For example, the grandson of a doctor who was raised to be a doctor and says, no, I'm not going to be a doctor. That's emancipation in the small meaning of not being what you were meant to be, giving your existence a path of your own. So school has to do with it. School experience, not just teaching. It may be the contact that you have with your classmates, cultural activities that go on in school. So we cannot deny that this happens. On the other hand, we cannot deny that schools privilege the privileged. We can't deny that. That's a fact. So we inherited schools, school form. And school form brings with it this paradox of being at the same time a place in which you can find your way through life, and also an institution that tells you where you belong to, for a number of reasons. So the question is, for me, that if you are aware of that paradox, you may behave different. You may ask yourself if you're favoring one or another point. But you can't get out of this. It's in the structure of school system, in my point of view. Also because school is for me a free time scolaire in a very important sense. Now, mainly in Brazil. Before we had democratized school system in Brazil, you would see very, very often 8, 9, 10-year-old boys and girls selling candies in the red lights of the big cities, working, like Sandra was working. And then school is a place that they go to play, to meet friends, to be free from that struggle, that hard struggle of life. So it is a scolaire. But at the same time, the time in school is very ordered, so it's full of these paradoxes. Now, when you talk about schools in Brazil, the access to school in Brazil is very recent. I was telling Claudia that in the state of São Paulo, which is the richest state in Brazil, until the 70s and the 80s, only 15% of the students would go to what is the equivalent to junior high school. Most of them couldn't go through an exam that exists also in France to continue going to school in junior high school. And then we opened up, public school opened up to all these people. Yet at the same time, the school was like emptied from the contents and so forth. In fact, Sandra went to a public school when she was a kid. She went to a Catholic school, later on to a Catholic course, much later on, going after high school. And of course, school in Brazil was also, I used to say that it was like a Portuguese school of Ultramer. I don't know how you say that. Offshore, like the French school in Algeria or so. And it was exactly like a Portuguese school. And that up to 2005, we have, when was the law passed in Brazil of African history and culture?
20 years ago.
20 years ago. Until 20 years ago, students in Brazil would never study the history of their own people, the African, the Indians, they wouldn't study. Simple as that. So it was again, another paradox, That's why I said that she was obliged, and they are still obliged, to see their history through the white, dominant eyes of the European tradition. But at the same time, I tell you, at the same time, it is because these young people have gone to school that they may read books from important African writers like Ashley or someone else. Another paradox that schools have in Brazil is that usually when you go to a public school, it is very difficult that you make it to the university because you have an entrance exam for public university. That's very difficult. It's very hard. So until not long ago, most people who could go to public universities would come from private schools. So again, the school giving privilege to those already privileged. And this is true. But at the same time, it is a privilege for those, not a privilege, but it has become a right for those children that did not have any chance of reading a book, at least to have a place where they go, where the conflicts are not solved with violence, or usually are not solved with violence. There is some violence sometimes, but through the words. It's like if they got into a different world where they may read a book, write poems, etc. So this is also true. And I do understand when European critics of schools, but I think that's the point. I think in Brazil, going to school may just save your life from crime, from drugs, whatever. You know, you're at school. It's something different. So it is a protection. For example, the policeman cannot get into the school, and policeman is a threat to everyone who is poor, and if you're poor and black, is a double threat. And they're at school, they cannot enter. They do sometimes, but they cannot. You know, so it works as a kind of social protection. It works as a way of making some aspects of our culture a common shared culture. And I think this is quite important. But at the same time, we cannot close our eyes to the fact that our school very often is a colonized school. It's a colonized school. This is true. Well, this, you know, school is an European invention. I think it's a very interesting invention, mainly because you have the books. For me, it's no wonder that this thing happened to Sandra at the school library, where you do not have a textbook. You have books that you can read. No one is controlling what you're reading. So that's why I look at it as a paradox. But it's an interesting paradox. I don't think I really answered that. I think your question is too complicated, so it just...
If I may just very
yeah,
quickly point
please.
out, just to say, I think I don't disagree with you on the basic description and analysis. On the contrary. But how I put it, rather not in terms of a paradox, but exactly as you explained it just now, and you did clarify that point, is that as an institution and as an organization, two distinct things, but the school is actually a space where contradictory colonizing projects takes place. I don't think there is a paradox, but there are contradictory things happening. So that for me the question is not to inhabit the paradox, because that's a Sisyphean kind of position, but is how to inhabit the contradictory agendas and how to maneuver through that, which gives rise to a completely different set of questions with regard, for example, to teacher education, etc., etc., etc. So, thank you. No,
I understand your point. I think, Andrea, this has to do with from what theoretical perspective we observe the phenomenon, right? From a Ricardian point of view would be one thing, from a Marx point of view would be another thing. And we never capture reality without a certain theoretical glass or lens, you know? But maybe I think we could think of it as inhabiting the contradiction too. I have to give a thought on that.
Thank
Is
you.
that great?
Thank you.
Thank you for your observation. Yeah, Kathy.
Thank you, José. That was a really informing talk, and I really appreciated hearing your perspective about a variety of things. My name is Kathy, by the way. I'm from the School of Nursing, but I'm retired. And in listening to what you had to say about contrasting the knowledge with philosophy, and in listening to what you were saying about theoretical perspectives and how there's very little that's atheoretical, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about philosophy and how philosophy informs education, especially in the current context of the corporatization of higher education and academia.
Yeah, Kathy. In fact, that was one of the challenges of this text, because I did want to stress the difference between approaching schooling from a philosophical point of view and from a sociological or historical point of view. I think, in a certain way, the kind of commitments you have in each of these fields are different. It is like if sociology, for example, or history wanted to give a picture of an empirical fact, and we judge this truthful or falsehood of this picture that you have, this description that you have, comparing, for example, to an empirical fact. I think in a certain way, maybe my colleagues will disagree completely with me, but what philosophy may do is somewhat close to what literature does. In what sense? Even when literature creates a world that does not exist, the world of Harry Potter, of course that's a way of portraying, configuring. I like the word configuring because you have the figured image. You are configuring a human experience. But you may use some metaphors, and I know people will say, but you're talking about philosophy, how come metaphor, and not concept and argument? Of course, philosophy has arguments, has concepts, but a lot of metaphors. Just think of Plato's dialogues, for example, when he's, for example, in Symposium, the dialogue starts with two people talking. Oh, you were there at that dinner, etc. So, no, I wasn't there, but someone was there and told me. And this is a big metaphor to tell us, listen, this subject is so complicated that we will have only a grasp of it. I can't get it. Or at the end of this dialogue, when everybody's drunk, sleepy, and then there is Socrates again, going out, the sun is rising, and then he goes out. This is such an image. I think it's stronger than a lot of arguments he uses. And I could go on and on and on with metaphors. But the important thing is that you have an experience, you configure that experience into a narrative, a book, whatever, and then someone reads that and reconfigures, like Sandra did, that experience. Because when we finish a book, when we start reading a book, we get into this book's world. That's why, for example, we're reading John Steinbeck, and we cry when he has to kill his friend. We cry like if it were true, because it is true. And then I think when, I'm not talking about philosophy as a whole, but when you take philosophy as a possibility of narrating scenes like Rancière does. You create a scene, and of course you can ask, all the 19th century workers in French did like Goni? No. What's the percentage of workers that had the same chance as Goni? I don't know. But this narrative tells me it is possible. This is the point. It is possible to have that experience. So, I think the role of philosophy there is just to provide one comprehension of reality. It's not to say exactly how many people like Sandra did what she did. To say this is possible. So these stories tell us, like the story of a revolution. Why is it important? Because telling the story of a Hungarian revolution tells us that it is possible to fight for something else. It doesn't tell us how to fight. And that's philosophy too. I don't know how the teacher will do it, but it may tell people that this is possible. There are paradoxical situations, there are conflicts, but this is possible. And a bit also to understand better our own situation, I do think that Sandra reconfigured her own story after having read Rancière. And I think Rancière would be really glad to know about this story. I think I'll send him probably this story one day. I don't know if he will read it. So, just like, I think there are different commitments, scientific inquiry and philosophical inquiry. In the sense that philosophy just maybe help us to attribute a meaning. And attribute a meaning is not a challenge for scientific inquiry. You know what I mean? They're not there to attribute a meaning to experience. Just to describe it, to understand, to explain it, depending on what kind of science you're doing. Explain or understand, but not a meaning. And I do think, of course, scientific research is crucial for us, even for technology. But I do think we lack meaning in our world. I think it's important sometimes to foster an activity related to meaningfulness of what we experience. And I think this is is proper to philosophy, or to a certain type of philosophy. Of course, you have other ones, conceptual analysis, logic, analytical philosophy, whatever. But
yeah. Question that I actually like to take the chance as a chair to follow up on this and to connect, maybe bring it back to Silas's question as well, because I'm intrigued by this other potential paradox or contradiction. There's a very interesting line, I think just one line in your paper, that's sort of one, and very Rancière. Once you have had the experience of being an equal in the social order of unequals, you cannot return to that social order the same way. Now, we can take that in different ways. We can take that either as just at the individual level. You've had some experience that can be meaningful. Nobody can ever take that experience away from you. It's an individual experience. Or we can take it more as that kernel of possibility. Like you said, we've learned something's possible, as a kernel of hope, as a possibility that that person will enact forms of resistance because they can never accept the social order as it is ever again, perhaps even instigate a revolution. The question, of course, is if you say, well, I don't actually think that we're living in the paradox. We're not resolving the paradox. We're living in the paradox. We think of this as a paradox. A cynical interpretation would be, well, then creating these small experiences of equality in a social order of unequals is a wonderful mechanism of distraction to keep people living in the paradox, because every once in a while I may have an experience of equality while the social order doesn't change. So are we caught in mechanisms of distraction when we are content, or at least accept living in the paradox? Or should we turn back to Silas and say, wait, are we trying to shift where the barriers of the paradox, where the division of the paradox lies? And I was intrigued by that, because if you're saying, well, it gives us an experience of possibility. But again, is that just the experience of possibility is what keeps me individually going? Or it's the experience of possibility that makes me go back into that social order and never accept it the way it is again, and therefore enact different forms of resistance?
I think there's an even more cynical reading. I think it's that, like a Zizekhian reading would be like that you create these moments of equality to release the tension so that you can reinforce the domination system. So it's like, it's not even that they're emancipatory or that they're good, but that they're feedback in to recreating the entrapment. So I just heighten the, like, I don't know.
Yeah, but I think there is an assumption behind this question. And this assumption is that we can solve and overcome domination. I do not think so. I don't think we can get to a place that we can call equal and free. Rancière says that he used le partage du sensible, that's this sharing, I don't know how it was. The distribution, but the word partage in French is more interesting, because partage is division, but also your part. Huh? So this division of the sensible is always like a mathematical. That's why I didn't want to improvise, because these terms in English don't come to my mind. But this distribution of the sensible, who occupies what places, is like a mathematical division, that you always have something left. I don't know exactly how you say that, but you're like 22 divided by 5, and then you have 2 left. And then you divide again, and you're going to have something else left, and then divide again, something else left. Forever. This is quite different from a Marxist point of view, in which inequalities will be overcome forever and will be free forever. I'm closer to Rancière's point of view. I don't think we'll get there. But there are divisions and divisions. There are, more or less just divisions. Not more or less, but there are, you may live in a place like Canada, in which social inequalities are not like in Brazil. And that's why it's important to inhabit other worlds, through literature, through history, through whatever. Because you know that the real is not the necessary, it's contingent. It will always be contingent. I don't think that's a very conforming, reformist position. It is just that, in fact, and it's a belief, it's an assumption. I don't think we'll get to this free and equal society. That's it. So what we can do, live this experience, struggle for a better social distribution, not only of wealth, but of symbolic, because this is a point for me. So often we attribute to schools a task school is not capable of doing, which is economical justice. This is a matter for economists. They do nothing, and then they ask us to do what they can't do. And at the same time, they take out the political meaning of the struggle for social justice. But there are things we can do. Giving a poor black girl the opportunity to read poetry as if she were, a lady from the master's house premises. This is a symbolical equality. And you say symbolical equality is not the same as equality, is a type of equality. And it's not unimportant. I think this idea that the only thing that matters is economical relationship, I don't know. What I saw in Brazil is not that. Brazil's economy under Bolsonaro was awful. And he had 49% of votes. 49. So there is also a symbolic world. And I think there are two different fights. You understand what I mean? There is a political fight. But as school teachers, we're in the symbolic world. And then there we have to share, because it's not shared equally either. Literature, history, physics, ceramics, that's the point. That's what we can do, I think. Now, what are the facts? I don't know. I think they're unpredictable. Maybe, says, well, that's fine, finally I read some poems. And maybe not. I'm going to struggle in the political arena for something else. I don't know. I don't care. It's not that I don't care, but it doesn't make any difference for me, but it's their lives, Just what I do is to share, to change this distribution, the symbolical distribution. I think this is what is up to school. No, we don't make a revolution at school. And that's also the point. When we don't want to do it politically, when we don't want to do the revolution out there, when you don't want to be active citizens, and then we educate this generation to be active tomorrow. And then tomorrow, and then tomorrow. No. We got to do what we got to do in terms of politics, and then we got to do what to do in terms of teaching. It's not that they are completely apart, but they're not the same thing. Like we discussed in the meeting that you held, right, Sam?
Mine is very, not very complicated academic thing, but I just want to understand in a very simplistic way that who created this school.
Can you speak a little bit louder?
Mine is very simple understanding the school is not something is created by someone else. We the people, we created school, we created curriculum, everything. So the experience students are getting inside the school is a result of these organizing all of them. And behind, we are the main architect. So then the question is, if we say that we can get out of the paradox, then whether theoretically we are opposing our own standing as well. Because if people can create a school, then people can overcome that paradox as well. And particularly there are so many ways of understanding, but if we try to understand from the failure point of view, failure said things can be possible, and education is political too, right? School is political too. In that case, I was wondering whether MST can help us to understand this paradox. MST means I refer to the Brazilian language workforce movement. they created their own school as well. Right? So from that point of view, I was thinking that will that experience help us to understand, to overcome this paradox.
Yeah. Well, first, connecting with what you said, with what I was saying before, of course, I try to stress the importance of what is the political meaning that we give to our profession, to our everyday work. I think this is very important. What does it mean for us politically to be a teacher, to go to school? Even though what we do in the classroom is not exactly outside politics. But I think this is a particularity about Brazil too. As we are not very efficient in terms of ruling the schools, you have a lot of room for interesting experiences at school. Not regulated, interesting experience. We have less and less room exactly because of this insistence on measuring the quality of schools because of the outcomes in terms of learning. Not in terms of education in a broad sense, but in terms of learning. So the more we insist in having good scores, the less we have the chances of trying different kinds of schools. But we have had, I've known of such wonderful experiences of schools in Brazil, like I was telling Claudia, the movement of the workers with no land. Land possession is a problem in Brazil. And then you have this big, important social movement of the workers that work on the land but do not own the land. And they have their own schools. And they're fantastic schools. That's incredible experiences. So we have a lot of those experiences. Huh? So in this sense, I think the more the state controls a school, the more is a reproductive device. And I think no wonder Bourdieu is French. You know, a school that some time ago, any history teacher knew exactly what was being discussed Wednesday morning in what school in France or in Algeria or wherever they were. Right? So this it's also a paradox because without states we do not have public schools, but state schools are not exactly public schools. They are
State and social organization co-governance is doable and possible. MST is.
yeah. Oh, you know MST. Yeah.
MST is the example. So therefore,
Yeah.
trying to understand
And there is another student I supervised his work about a school in Bahia, in northeastern Brazil, that was completely controlled by the community. It's unbelievable, it's wonderful. And they had some financing from the federal government up to Bolsonaro's. And then they didn't have any more, of course. Yes,
I really liked your talk. I couldn't help thinking about Du Bois's parable of the coming of John and the parallels, and it almost was distracting. I was walking through another story as your story went on. I probably missed some details because of it, but I guess I had two things that stood out to me. The first was that the kind of Enlightenment, common school, public school project, and then the kind of turn against that project because it failed, was sort of, I don't know, from my particular historical point of view, sort of, that was
that was the turning against the prior religious schools,
Yeah.
and those religious schools often were the turns against the prior cultural. In other words, sort of the picture of that you locate paradox in within a historical understanding is sort of a series of like the means end description you gave earlier. So that part of the story was one that I thought was perhaps an irony of the situation, that sort of the movement to the public or to the common school was itself a movement away from a different type of school, the religious and a different style of things, and I think throughout Latin America there's a really interesting historical movement, and also kind of, I guess in this sense, truly paradoxical life of, in particular, Catholic institutions and public institutions, and where one finds sort of even the communal institution. It's complicated. I can appreciate that. But the part that stood out to me the most was some of the initial framing of the question of the sort of, and obviously I'm projecting it right here, but sort of, I've always thought it's weird. So the philosopher teaches the teachers who teach the students in the school, right? So I've often wondered about that. In Plato, so you have the guardians and the education of the guardians, which is the imagination of Socrates. And I've always wondered, so I'm guessing that the philosopher teaches the teachers who censor the poets in order to teach the guardians who then protect the city. In other words, like I've always wondered, like, kind of like, where does my job description fit, here? And one of the things that's interesting about that metabolism of pedagogy is, in the more historical sense of the pedagogos, the philosophers who were employed by the Roman aristocracy were, in some sense, entrusted with, you could say, the intellectual project of the aristocratic Romans. And they were also, though, subjugated teachers who had authority nonetheless. The pictures we have in antiquities where they had a switch and a primer right in their hand, a switch and a scroll. And I think most of modern education has been about getting rid of the switch, and now we seem to want to get rid of the scroll too. And I kind of agree with you about your approach to it again. But I've often wondered about the question of freedom for the teacher, and in particular for the philosopher who teaches the teacher. Like, perhaps we're not permitted, because the guardians, for instance, can't own property. There's a lot of restrictions, and the orders show that vows of poverty, vows of, in other words, we think a lot about the fate of the student, and we're rooting for them, right? We want them to be emancipated. But the story was, she enrolled herself to be a philosopher, teacher. Like, that's terrible, right? She in a way, she gave up her freedom to go and emancipate people, which for me is a little bit, like, I don't want my kids to be philosophers. I want them to be, investment bankers and like all the things that, one wants to be, to have a good life, And so I wonder, in your story of freedom and paradoxes and stuff, like, is there any hope for philosophers who teach teachers? Are we like Moses? Like, do we get to walk up to the promised land, but then we don't get to go inside? Is this our fate, right? Is this the goal, or is there an exit, or how do I get out of this?
I don't know. See, well, I start with the idea of the promised land, I think...
I say that the term promised land is a contentious term to start with.
Yes.
We can go
Sure.
on.
Oh, yeah, fair enough.
But I think the promised land is what leads us to move. It's not a place that we get to. I don't think we get to the promised land. sometimes is what gives sense to our work. But it's not a place we get to. It's a metaphor. And that's what I think also about our work, you know. But just one point about enlightenment. Huh? I think that the narrative of enlightenment and autonomy, when you think on that text on answer to the question, what is enlightenment? I don't know if that's the... Knowledge occupies a very big, important position. You know, the free public discussion is among knowledgeable people. Huh? There's no way out of it. There's knowledge. As if knowledge would emancipate us. What I try to stress here is that emancipation maybe has more to do with judging than having knowledge. And this is also two separate things. Huh? It's just... So, and if I go back to, all I can tell you, Sam, is, and in fact, this text is very much what I learned from my experience. In a certain sense, is that philosophy makes sense for a student teacher when he's capable of understanding the text and connecting this with his life and his challenge, just like we do with literature, just like we do with poetry, with songs, you know, when you may connect that with your own experience. Of course, to connect that with your experience, you got to do a lot of attentive reading, like we did with Lancier. You know, it didn't come to her mind like that. You know, 2 months of reading text really carefully. But then, I think philosophy class is just a time and a place that we may have a dialogue with that people, you know, with their works, so that our experience may make sense. No more than that, you know. For me, that's okay if that happens in the classroom. And in fact, Sam, I think I learned that being a philosophy teacher in secondary schools, when I had to make sense out of a text from Plato, you know. So how do I do it? But that's it. I think our role there is just this, you know. Some people thought about things before us. Some people questioned themselves, can I really teach virtue? You know, just, well, and those thoughts, they're interesting for us now.
Sure.
This is also about the difference about philosophy and sciences, because usually, I think you, in some way, you can say of a certain progress in science. For example, in physics, you don't read medieval or Aristotelian physics anymore. It doesn't make sense.
Sure.
But in philosophy, for us, it makes sense to read Plato as we read Arendt or whoever. It does make sense, going back to the past. But our challenge is always to how could I say, to overcome the distance from our present to that text. This is a big challenge. And in class, I think the challenge is to overcome the distance between the theoretical text and the experience. Not to tell the teacher what he's going to do when he's teaching fourth grade students, but just again, encourage him to think about the meaning of being there. Because I think, I mean, if a teacher does not attribute meaning to his class, it is all lost. Huh? I mean, it may be effective, but it's meaningless, you know. Yeah. And this thing too, schools, now we have to have schools for, you know, citizenship education, for economical growth, so many finalities, and absolutely no meaning.
Yeah.
You know, it's just a bunch of finalities without any meaning. I don't know how you can educate. That's why I stress so much the idea of searching for a meaning. And of course, this changes. Huh? The meaning of school now, for me, is not the same as it was 10 years ago, 5 years ago. But it's this meaning that make us wake up in the morning, go to class and give classes, you know, just...
I'm David Coulter. I'm retired from this department. I'm about 8 years retired. I will come over some of this. Before that, I was in this department for 20 years, and before that, I spent 25 years working in schools.
Working in schools.
I'm a little bit out of practice talking to anybody except myself about some of these things. A few people can allow me to inflict myself on me. But I was particularly interested in what I was hearing was a very original approach to a lot of what you were talking about. That's obviously part of my bias, things I'm interested in. I was particularly interested in the way you're using Arendt's approach to thinking, which is a Socratic thinking, and destroying things and taking things apart, and his approach to judging, which is a very Kantian aesthetic approach to judging. Both of those things seem to be both of those approaches that you're talking about, you in some sense advocated, are a challenge to the way we do things in schools now. And I think Canadian schools are much like French schools, and the Portuguese schools is about measuring things and holding people accountable. What seems to me that having people from the university come into schools to tell them how to teach is going to be an interesting process. So I was thinking about what kinds of things, what are the conditions and requirements that need to be thought about carefully about what it's like to be in a school, particularly schools now. One of the, I don't know about in your situation, I know the schools in the last 5 years in Vancouver have changed dramatically as a consequence of the pandemic, and they're still dealing with that. I can say that with great certainty since I have 4 members of my immediate family who work in schools in Vancouver. And I know that, for example, it's very unusual for an elementary school teacher in Vancouver not to be hit several times a month by some kids who are really in some difficulty. So it's a very strange world we're talking about. So I was asked, what kinds of conditions would be necessary for this approach to be considered? You see, one of the ways to begin to think about that is what would happen in Portugal or France if you tried to do this at the university level? These are very different ways of thinking about education than most faculties and departments have to think about that. How would you even begin to have that conversation with colleagues in the university? What some of the things that you would have to consider that would be even entertained.
Mm-hmm.
The universities are pretty unentertaining sometimes.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think maybe most of my colleagues at the university would think that what I do is pure poetry. which for me is fine because I love it, you know. But pure poetry means okay, but we have to learn, you know, we have to teach them how to teach. Okay, but I also think that maybe what we can do in university is really pay attention to what goes on at school. You know what I mean? School is not just a place that you apply theoretical guidelines, you know. It is a place that puts questions for us at university, you know. I mean, it provokes us to think. That's why I say philosophy of education for me is not just about normative horizons. Just the act of education is something that really challenges our thinking. Just pay attention to school. Sometimes that's what but maybe I do that because I've worked at school since I was 19. You know, I started very early as a teacher. And I think there are so many interesting things going on that maybe university could also be less normative in terms of schooling and learn a lot if you really pay attention on, like you say, like Sam says, what's going on at school? Remember you said like the Marvin Gaye song, what's going on there? You know, I think that's a question we could do. And another one, usually I tell my students when they are undergraduate, they come from history, philosophy, mathematics, etc. And I always joke with them and say, well, let's profit in this class to do something which is very rare at university nowadays, that's thinking. Quite often we spend one whole semester reading one or two texts. That's it. And think. Very slow in terms of texts to read. But I think most of my colleagues think that I'm a bit doing something old. But the students usually like it, you know. They like it. I think they profit from it. I don't know if it's useful for them. I don't think so, but I'm not searching for utility. Meaning just maybe this is also something we can do. Just one example of school as scolae, a time out. That's why, for example, in my classes, it's forbidden to use any kind of screen, any kind. We read text on paper, they handwrite the exercise for me, very old-fashioned. And I always feel it's a great opportunity to be free of that condition that you are always into, you know. This is a time free of screens, free of cell phones, free of internet, you know, just paper, book, you know, pencil and pen, you know, just... But I do think, last word, I do think, another paradox or contradiction, I have to think it over, that we do have the opportunity of doing that in schools and universities. I do have the opportunity to say, listen, here we are going to read texts on paper, handwrite, and have a slow, you know, everything is fast, so here it's a slow. I always make that joke. Here's not fast food, it's a slow spiritual food, very slow. And we do have the opportunity to do that. There's nobody that can really prohibit us to go slowly, you know.
I would suggest something you can correct me. If you approach that, by and large, at UBC, you would never get tenure promotion.
But I couldn't...
Going down won't get you tenure promotion at UBC. organized that way.
Yeah.
And I suspect we may be in this situation, but I think we've organized
Yeah.
so that isn't time to slow down and think about stuff.
No, at the University of São Paulo, we are also in that organized in that way in terms, for example, of writing articles. Yeah, it's a rhythm but not in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
The classroom dynamics is something that may be apart, I think. There we are all masters, students and teachers. We don't have to follow. We usually follow, but we don't have to follow orders. Right?
Can I propose on that more note?
Yeah.
We end this session. I want to thank you for giving us time. That was a form of schooling. That was a time of slowing down and of thinking. And to use a phrase my colleague of mine from the University of York sees education as passing time together, where that passing time together with the choice of company we keep is highly significant in how we learn and how we teach. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.